Oh, some of you have heard the tape too. Well, I really won't try to review 2 years ago material because there's some 9 hours of stuff, and I guess if you really want to catch up, you'll have to go and get the tapes at the bookshop. Let me start today where I left off before. Last time I simply repeated what had come through in the form of the so-called clock messages, as you remember, and I tried to clarify the meaning of these messages in Hebrew. Since then, the messages are much more complex in that they're not just little writings, they're what we call events involved, and I'll explain that as we go along. Let me start in August of 1983, last year. As you remember from previous discussions, I do work with a group of meditators who are scattered around the planet. And they're very quiet people. Nobody knows about them, and they don't particularly make themselves known in any way. But when we get some kind of information to go to work, I call them up, and they don't even ask questions. They just go ahead and go into meditation. And it's usually for some world problem, and usually connected with problems of peace, and the opposite, of course, war. So such a group was assembled in Kitchener, Ontario in August of 83, and some of you I know were there. And we met there because of the Mitchell Hedges skull, so-called crystal skull, which is one of the most unusual artifacts on the planet. For those of you who don't know about it, it was discovered in what is now British Honduras about almost 50 years ago by Miss Mitchell Hedges during an archaeological dig. And it is the most unusual artifact because experts all over the world have looked at it, have studied it, and they cannot figure out how it was made. There are no tool marks on it, not even abrasion dust from finger rubbing and so on. And therefore, it could have been produced not on this planet, or it could have been produced by some supernormal means like materialization. But the crystal skull itself, for those many psychics who have looked at it and worked with it, seems to be some kind of a computer which is continually registering all information of relevance on this planet. And whether it acts as a relay and sends information to somewhere else, we have no way of knowing, although that's a possibility. So our meeting was held in the presence of the crystal skull. And when you come in, be quiet because it's hard on the microphone and the taping, that noise. We met there and we had a very simple meditation, and we addressed ourselves to the intelligence of the skull and said we were very concerned about world peace. And world peace these days largely means the possibility or the potential of somebody unloosening the awesome power of the vast storehouse of nuclear missiles which exists on this planet. And that was a very mild event. Nothing unusual happened, and we went our separate ways. A few almost weeks later, I was in Los Angeles with a very dear friend, and we were sitting around having dinner, my wife and this friend. And somehow the question came up of the pyramid distribution on the planet. And I commented that the missing link, we have the well-known Great Pyramid in Egypt, we have the well-known pyramid complex in Mexico City, Teotihuacan, and there should be one somewhere out in the Pacific area to give symmetry to this whole picture. And I remember that I had read years ago in a National Geographic article a story that said there were pyramids in China. And I have since then been asking many, many people who are China experts if they knew about the pyramids in China. And everybody said, well, I've heard about them, but I've never seen them. Has anybody in this room heard of pyramids in China?
Would that be in the Gobi area?
No, no. Anyway, it's amazing how totally unknown this subject is. To make a long story short, our friend, his name is Donna, who's a film producer, said, you know, I've got to go to China and do a documentary. Why don't we all go along? I'll pay your way, and we'll see if we can find the pyramids. Great, I said, just what I've been waiting for 30 years. So to make a long story short, we did go to China in October of '83. And sure enough, we went to Shenxi province, which is about 700-800 miles inland from Shanghai, in a very spectacular mountainous area. And sure enough, after a little searching, there were some 60 spectacular pyramids. And they're as plain as the nose on your face. And why this isn't known, why it hasn't come out, I have no explanation. None of these pyramids have been excavated because the Chinese believe that they are mausoleums from ancient times, although they have no fixed history of when they were built. And the reason that we went there, which I must bring out now, is that it had some intimation from the clock messages that we must go there and activate these pyramids. Activating them means bring them back to operation and to life. And as part of this, I did bring a lot of instrumentation with me to check and double check certain things about these pyramids. The other thing I did before we went, not knowing whether the pyramids were there or not, that was a major problem, I went to 3 of the best dowsers that I know of in the world and gave them a map of the area where I believed the pyramids were, and asked each of them separately to dowse and put a pin in the map as to where they think the pyramids are. And it's an astounding thing. Each one of them pinpointed exactly the same spot. So I had confidence, first, that there were pyramids there, and secondly, that I would know exactly where to go and look for them from the map. Now, I told you we found the pyramids, but we were most interested in finding the spot on the map where these 3 dowsers had said the pyramid, the main pyramid, the power center pyramid existed. And there's a little funny side to the story in that we were able to rent a car and have a private driver and a translator, so we were not locked in, as most people are, to a tour group. And so this lovely driver, his name was Lee, was very cooperative, and if we wanted to get off the beaten path that they laid out for tourists, he would allow us to do that with a little clever maneuvering. So I brought out my map and I showed him the spot on the map that I wanted to go to, and he looked at it and he said, in Chinese, which was translated, no, you can't go there, there have been floods and it's impossible, forget it. So we persisted and persisted. We said, well, why can't we go? Why don't you bring us as close as you can and we'll walk the rest of the distance? He said, no, can't do. So finally, we were so persistent, he took us to the Board of Tourism, and we asked our question of these people, and they said, no, you can't go there. Floods, bad roads, so nobody goes there. So we persisted. Finally, it went up to the Ministry of State Security, which is kind of a FBI setup in China. And we persisted, and they said, absolutely no, not. And that ended the matter. Well, a day later, my wife was reading a book called Life in the Bitter Sea, a brand new book that just come out by New York Times reporter about China. And just by accident, as she was reading through the book, she found that the place that we wanted to go to was the hydrogen bomb assembly plant of China. I mean, talk about innocence abroad. I mean, we could have fallen into a booby trap. And of course, then I thought my 3 dowsing friends were playing some monstrous joke on us. But anyway, it turned out that the pyramid we were looking for was there. We wandered into a small provincial museum, and from 30 or 40 years ago, they had models of the pyramid that was in this area, which had been used, that is right near there, for the hydrogen bomb assembly plant. So having located the pyramid physically, what we did then was we triangulated it from a distance of about 30 miles away, and we'd meditate here, and then we meditate here, and we covered it just as though we had been in the, or on the actual pyramid itself. And again, it was the same purpose. The purpose was to work for peace, put it in a nutshell. Well, the trip was over. We came back to the States, and now the action really started. We had laid the groundwork for an appeal on behalf of all humanity for peace. And on Thanksgiving Day in the States, which is November 24th last year, I received a telephone call from Uri Geller. And he was a little down in the dumps about the situation, about world peace. The film, I forget what it's called, about the nuclear holocaust, some of you may have seen it, had just been shown, and he was, the day after, I'm sorry, that's the film, he was really concerned about that, and he was concerned about his personal life and career and so on. And he said, the worst thing that bothers me, he said, I haven't had any direct contact with our extraterrestrial friends for some time. He said, I wonder if they deserted me. I said, no, I don't think they deserted you. There just wasn't anything special you had to do. Now, there's a little background to the story. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my wife was walking up the stairs to the second floor of our home, which is in North Carolina, and as she would start to walk up the stairs, a smoke alarm at the head of the stairs, top of the stairs, would go off. It would go beep, 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 beep. And every time she did this, it would go beep, beep, beep. So, so we have a defective smoke alarm. We better get it fixed. So she asked me to fix the thing. So I went and looked at it. And I was rather busy. I didn't really have time to take it down and check the circuitry. And I couldn't find anything obviously wrong with it. So what I did was I just pulled the battery out so that it wouldn't go beep, beep, beep when people were walking up the stairs. And I put the battery away. Now back to my telephone conversation with Geller. The smoke alarm was about 20 feet from where the telephone was, where I was talking to him. And in the middle of the conversation with him, the smoke alarm went beep, 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 beep. And I said, Uri, wait a while. We're used to paranormal signals. So I said, let me check the thing. I thought maybe somebody had put the battery in when I wasn't looking in the smoke alarm. It took a minute to check the smoke alarm, and there was no battery in it. Smoke alarms do not work without a battery, if you know the principle of smoke alarms. I said, I think we got a message. I'll keep track of it and see what happens. Now, as I explained a couple of years ago here, what the usual messages are, one of these watches stops and starts in a certain pattern, and I record the actual time, which means a certain angle. And then I transpose that into Hebrew, which is the only language that works, and then I translate that back into English so I can really understand it. But I've noticed on other occasions that physical events will happen that are paranormal. Something may levitate or something may teleport or whatever. And so I note the time at which that event occurs, and it's just the same as the clock stopping and starting. So my wife said, why don't we just keep track of all the beeps on the smoke alarm, and see if we can get a message out of it. So to make a long story short, for 2 days we kind of took turns staying awake, and the thing would beep around the clock without the battery, and I would note down the time, and it lasted for about 2 days, and then the beeping stopped. And then I translated the message, and I will now read the message that occurred. And I won't bother with the Hebrew. This translation was made on November 30th, 1983, and it all came, as I said, from the beeping of a smoke alarm. Now, you have to remember that there's a symbolism to a smoke alarm, right? It means fire, trouble, okay? I'm giving it to you exactly as it came off without smoothing out the translation. Quote, "The Messiah speaks. Men of treachery now tread in the valley of the shadow of death. The head," that means Rosh, the head person out there, "will appear in shining splendor and moves to ease the terror of the potential annihilation. His greatness, his majesty, passes judgment." Passing judgment means passing judgment on the human race. And then it was signed in Hebrew Dalet, which in our English version says God. Now this is the first time in many, many years that I've ever got a message that was signed by somebody that high up in the executive system of the universe. And of course I was very much impressed by the solemnity of this message. Let me just now go back over it and interpret a little bit of this. And it says, "Men of treachery now tread in the valley of the shadow of death." That very specifically refers to leaders, people who have control of nuclear weapons, and treading in the valley of the shadow of death, of course, means their intention or thought to go ahead and loosen a nuclear war. And of course, that's no mystery. It's well known in Washington, for example, that the U.S. government is totally committed to a first strike policy. That means if they get the slightest wiggle on the radar system that a nuke is coming in, they're not going to question it. They're just going to immediately launch a first strike back at whatever is coming. And there's no mystery about the fact that the Soviet Union is also committed to the same policy. And to me, that's total insanity, but that's the kind of world we live in. When it says the head, or Rosh, to use the Hebrew word, Rosh means the head, the chief, will appear in shining splendor. And since the person who started the message, the Messiah, we must assume that there will be some kind of reappearance of the person that we, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, connect with the return of the Messiah. And the next part, "and moves to ease the terror of the potential annihilation," something that will develop as we get along. I can't explain that fully right now. Well, I began to think, and I conferred with Uri Geller on this matter, what we could do, and we said, well, we don't know what to do. We'll just have to wait for a sign. And in the meantime, I had to go to Israel in middle of December '83 for a conference. I think it's the first conference ever held in Israel on prophecy. And it was a marvelous meeting. All the different faiths of the world were assembled there. There were Buddhists, and there were Hindus, and there were Muslims, and there were a lot of Kabbalists from Israel, and there were astrologers, and anybody who thought they had some idea of what was going to come in the future. a film has been made of that conference, and I understand it hasn't been put together yet. Hopefully someday it'll get released so people can see what was said. But as my part of the proceedings, I went into great detail in this message I just read to you, but since I had the help of some of the best Kabbalists on the planet, we went at it strictly in Hebrew. And it caused a tremendous stir amongst them, because what they were concerned with primarily, that's the reason they were at the meeting, was they were concerned about the manifestation or manifestations of the signs of the coming of the Messiah. And this was one of the most important manifestations. They agreed with my translation. They had a lot more things to say than I did, because they knew the great tradition of the Kabbalah and were able to interpret things in this message which I had not been able to interpret. Anyway, we had a great meeting of minds, and even though I myself am not a Kabbalist and I'm not Jewish, I was totally accepted into the tradition, which is very important, not as a person, but as somebody who had picked up a bit of the message. And I think the energy developed at that meeting in Jerusalem was very much like the energy we developed here in Kitchener, Ontario. It was a tremendous, electrifying meeting of minds, and minds who had been prepared for thousands of years for something like this. So that was that part of the story. I came back to the States, and by this time I had decided, all on my own, without any advice or information or messages, that what we had to do is call another meeting of meditators. But this time, we sent the word out that all the meditators who could come from all over the world were to meet in Houston, Texas, because a lot of our people were there, on January 29th, 1984. Now, I did not tell them why I was calling the meeting, because I didn't want to prejudice anybody. People get very hysterical when things like this come along, and they're not cool about it. So I kept the secret to myself of what I've just told you. We met, and about 60 people showed up. And as was the custom with this group, there's one lady whose name is Shri, that's her Hindu name, although she's an American, would usually lie in the center of the meditators, and if she had any message that she picked up, she would relay it as a trance medium. And so since there was some unusual potential behind this meeting, everybody expected some unusual message. Well, what happened was quite the opposite. Shri lay down in the center, everybody was there supporting her, went into meditation, and she didn't say a word. She lay there for 3.5 hours, absolutely silent. And finally she came out of it, and I was the first to speak to her. I said, "What happened? I mean, it's not the usual mode of behavior." She said, "Well, as soon as I lay down, I was taken out of my body, and I wasn't in that room at all. And I was taken out, not very far, just around the planet Earth. And I was shown how the extraterrestrial people were picking very specific individuals on the planet to be censors, who would immediately pick up the intent of anybody who was going to press a button and start a nuclear holocaust." And she said there were about 100 or 150, I couldn't count the exact number, but they are all over the planet. They're connected like a vast spider web, and you know how a spider web works. If an insect lands at any point, it goes into vibration, and the spider at the other end immediately gets a signal that there's something edible out there, and it goes for it. And that was very interesting to me, but I didn't quite understand the full implications of that. Now, there's another parallel side story which finally solved the mystery of what this lady Shri had seen in this 3.5-hour visit into outer space around the planet. As part of my visit to Houston, I had to stop and see a lady whose name is not important, except she turned out to be very important, about some electronic equipment. I'd heard of a new product which had come out on the market, and I had not seen it. I knew she had this product, and I was interested in checking it to see if the people who were manufacturing this product were infringing on some of my patents. A very pedestrian operation. So I spent 2 hours with her the day before, that is January 28th, looking over this equipment, and that was it. And I hadn't met her before, and didn't see her after that. Well, 1 week after this meditation event on January 29th, I got a package in the mail from this lady who I'd visited about some electronic equipment. And I opened the package, and there was a very cheap kind of a plastic kitchen clock about this big across, about 8.5, 9 inches. And the face of it was a round plastic cover for the clock. And if you can imagine this, maybe I'll draw this. It'll be more graphic. You know, it's nice to have this thing on me. I don't have to worry about what's going on with the microphone. Thanks. Anyway, here's the clock face, like this. Okay? And here's the number 9, and here's 12, and there's 3, and there's 6, and numbers in between. The clock, for reasons unknown to me, was stopped like this. Now, this face, plastic face on the clock, had, I can't even draw it, fine lines like this. And I counted these very carefully with the use of a microscope. There were 135 little lines radiating from here to here across this. And as I looked at it, some of you may know from the last session 2 years ago that the extraterrestrials that we deal with are called the 9. And all the energy radiated from, or the cracks radiated from 9 and went over to the 3. Now, I looked at that clock and I realized that there's no way that you can make that kind of crack. You have to see this to really believe how these cracks were made. And I took it to several of my physicist friends. I said, could you artificially create a set of cracks like that? And they said, no, I don't know how we could do it, even with vacuum and extreme cold, to have this uniform, strange pattern. Well, then I realized that I was looking at a physical map of the mind link that had been described to me by Sri a week earlier. So I had before me, in my hands, the physical proof from a total stranger almost of the reality of what we had been able to do in our meditation. So then I called up this lady and I said, what's the story behind this clock? She said, well, I saw you on the 28th, and on the 30th I came home from some of my chores, and my mother said, did you drop the clock? And I said, no. She said, well, the clock's all cracked. So I looked at the clock, and it wasn't even off the peg in the kitchen. It was still there, and there was no evidence that it had been dropped. So I realized intuitively and immediately, since I read your books and knew about your 9 business, this has something to do with you, and I just put it in the package and I mail it to you without any note. I figured you'd understand it. Anyway, that was the background. There was no physical damage to it as far as this lady knew, and so it must have been a paranormal mapping event. So we felt, based on this sequence of experience, the crystal skull, the Chinese pyramid activation, the great energy in Jerusalem with the Kabbalists and other prophets, and then the clock event and the meditation, that somehow our appeal had been answered. Monitoring setup had occurred over the planet, and that we had every reason to believe that the problem had become so bad on Earth in terms of people getting shaky and nervous about pushing a button, that the extraterrestrials had taken over and ensured us that such events would not happen. And I personally feel very confident in my own heart that this is true, that we do not have to worry about a nuclear attack or war starting. And the reason for that is that this network has been set up by through dedicated people on this planet. And